there, and welcome back for our next lesson in APUS history. I'm your APUSH Lady Boss, and today we're tackling topic 3.8, the Constitutional Convention and debates over ratification. So your learning objective from the College Board states that we are to explain the differing ideological positions on the structure and function of the federal government. So really this is part one of a two-part series on the Constitution. The College Board does separate the Constitution into two different lessons, and so today we're focusing on some of the compromises that occurred. We're going to talk about slavery, slave trade, and we're also going to talk about the ratification debates and the Bill of Rights. So here you can see is the outline covering those things that the College Board emphasized in the curriculum framework. So let's start with just a little historical context. As you remember from the previous lesson, we talked about the Articles of Confederation. Now, specifically, we want to remind ourselves of the challenges that were happening under the Articles, which dealt a lot with finances, inability to pay back their war debts, both domestically and to foreign countries, which affected trade. The lack of power in the central government left an inability to deal with trade disputes or to maintain an army to effectively engage in the conflict in the Western territories. And then Shays' rebellion was also a major catalyst for convincing people like George Washington that some changes need to be made. And so George Washington hosted a conference, and what they determined there was that these problems do need further review. So they called for a convention in Annapolis to discuss revising the Articles. And while they were there, they decided further deliberation was needed, and so they scheduled the Philadelphia Convention for 1787. A famous quote from George Washington at this time is, "Have we fought for this? Was it with these expectations that we've launched into a sea of trouble and have bravely struggled through the most threatening danger?" Basically, what we envisioned for our country when we went on this revolutionary movement, this is not what we were expecting. And so we need to make some changes. So the Constitutional Convention, also known as the Philadelphia Convention, had 55 delegates from all states except for Rhode Island. Now, when we look at who were the delegates, it's pretty expected for what we would think for this time period. They were all white male, many college educated. They were fairly young. Average age was in their early 40s, and they were far wealthier than the average American. So then we want to think about, well, who wasn't there? Some of the major people we consider to be our founding fathers were not. John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Sam Adams, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, none of them were at the Constitutional Convention. And obviously, all women, African Americans, and American Indians were not present here. So another aspect of this structure is that we see George Washington rising to prominence, once again elected as the chairperson, and then the creation of the Constitution is going to fall to a few different people, but the most well-known for this act is going to be James Madison, who becomes called the father of the Constitution. So here is probably the most famous image of the Constitutional Convention, looking fairly calm, if you will, just a few people raising hands here, when in reality it was quite a contentious event. So let's preview some of the key issues. It begins with sharp disagreement over the purpose of the convention. The delegates thought they were coming to revise the Articles, and people like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison basically saying, nope, we're starting over. We're drafting a new document. And so the three key issues that we're going to be discussing in the next slides are representation, slavery, and trade. So first, looking at representation, the key question that they are trying to figure out is, should larger states have proportionally more representatives in Congress than smaller states? Under the Articles of Confederation, there is equal representation. Each state gets one vote. So James Madison will propose the Virginia Plan, which is going to favor large states like Virginia and New York, where representation will be based on population. So the larger a state, the more votes they have, the more power they have. New Jersey will follow suit and propose their own plan to favor smaller states and have equal representation. The Great Compromise is what is going to bring the two sides together. And what they create is called a bicameral house, two houses, bicameral Congress. And so what we have is the Senate with equal representation for each state, and then the House of Representatives, which has proportional representation. So the larger states have more representation and more votes. So the next key issues are related to slavery. This threatened to disperse the whole convention. So the first one we're going to talk about is, should the slave trade be allowed? Well, what they decided was that they weren't going to decide. They decided, we are just going to delay this decision for 20 more years. In 1808, that Congress can make the decision about whether they will abolish the slave trade or not. Now, in 1808, Congress did do that, but it's interesting to look at what happened in those 20 years. From 1787 to 1808, more than 200,000 Africans were forcibly enslaved. In the prior years, from 1610 to 1707, 400,000 Africans were forcibly taken. So in just 20 years, they imported half as many as had been done in the previous 170 years. The next key question is, should enslaved people be counted in state populations? Well, of course, states with high populations of enslaved persons wanted them to be counted, and states without high populations of enslaved people did not. So what they came up with was the 3/5 compromise, where each enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of determining a state's level of taxation and representation. Now, James Madison states, "Great as the evil is, dismemberment of the Union would be worse." And another important quotation here by Governor Morris is discussing how unethical these compromises are. He says, "The inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa, and in defiance of the most sacred law of humanity, tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connection and damns them to the most cruel bondages, shall have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of the rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey who views with laudable horror so nefarious a practice." Moving on to our next key question about trade. How should the federal government be involved with foreign and interstate commerce? So there's a desire for the central government to be part of the regulating of trade. This hadn't gone well under the Articles when the central government did not have that power, but there was a fear, especially over export taxes. And so what happens is called the Commercial Compromise. It allows for Congress to regulate trade. It does place tariffs on foreign imports, but it prohibits taxes on exports. So thus, it brought the two sides together and they were able to move on. So they complete the document in September 17th, 1787, and the draft of the Constitution then is submitted to the states for ratification. Only 39 of the original 55 delegates chose to sign it, and they determined that 9 out of 13 states would be required for ratification, and then it would be a legal document. So each state is supposed to hold a convention, vote on the Constitution, and this takes place for about a year. So Benjamin Franklin, trying to discuss that the Constitution isn't perfect, states this: "Several parts of this Constitution, which I do not at the present approve, but the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and pay more respect to the judgment of others. I doubt, too, whether any other convention we can obtain may be able to make a better Constitution." So basically saying it's not perfect, but it's better than anything else we might come up with. Let's just move forward. So we have two sides that develop, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists are going to support the Constitution. These are not our political parties. Now, if you're watching this as review, you might recall that, Federalists are a political party. But here, this is more of like a single issue group trying to obtain one singular task of ratifying the Constitution. So famous leaders, George Washington, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, they believe the federal government is necessary. Their strategy is to compare it to the Articles and show how much better it is. And they're very well organized. Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, oppose the Constitution. And you might recognize some of the people there: Patrick Henry, John Hancock. And they believe that tyranny is going to happen as a result of the Constitution, that this stronger federal government is just going to reinstate a government similar to the monarchy in Britain. And they are adamant that this Constitution needs to have an explicit protection of individual rights. Now, their main advantage is that people are generally distrustful of government after the Revolutionary War. And so they're able to appeal to that distrust to gain followers for their cause of opposing the Constitution. So some of the arguments, what the Federalists do, specifically what James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay do, is they create the Federalist Papers, 85 essays that are kind of similar to what you think about with common sense, that it is presenting logical arguments for why the Constitution is better than the Articles and people should vote for ratification. So it provides examples of how something like Shays' Rebellion would not happen or would be handled differently, that the federal government would be able to protect Western settlers against American Indians because they'd be able to maintain a military, that due to changes in taxation and regulating commerce, there would be improvements in the nation's credit rating, which would help with foreign issues. So here's an excerpt from one of those Federalist essays. The influence of factitious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, for any other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it, in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state. So basically saying, as a result of the Constitution, we will see less factions develop because they won't have the power that they would under the Articles of Confederation. So the opposition arguments, we see them most strongly evident in the Virginia Convention in 1788, where we see these strong anti-federalist coalitions basically say, we're not doing it. We're not ratifying it. And without Virginia, you're going to struggle to have any type of national strength or unity. Now, the Federalists in the state compromise. They say, fine, we will add a Bill of Rights. If we add the Bill of Rights, will you ratify? And they do. There is a very close vote, but Virginia does ratify the Constitution, which leads to our other last states, New York, North Carolina, Rhode Island, to follow suit. So here is a quote from an essay called Brutus No. 1 that was about why the Constitution should not be ratified. Momentous, then, is the question you have to determine, and you are called upon by every motive which should influence a noble and virtuous mind to examine it well and to make up a wise judgment. It is insisted, indeed, that this Constitution must be received, be it ever so imperfect. If it has its defects, it is said, they can best be amended when they are experienced. But remember, when the people once part with power, they can seldom or never resume it again, but by force. Many instances can be produced in which the people have voluntarily increased the powers of their rulers, but very few, if any, in which rulers have willingly abridged their authority. This is a sufficient reason to induce you to be careful in the first instance how you deposit the powers of government. So making the argument that we are about to give a lot of power to the federal government, and we don't want to make that mistake because even if we decide it is a mistake, there's very little proof of people fixing that in the past. So what was the outcome? Here's the order of the states who ratify the Constitution. As I mentioned, the Bill of Rights does convince Virginia and then other states to follow suit. The Constitution did become legal after New Hampshire. So Virginia and New York were not necessary, but they really were essential for showing that national unity and strength. So the last thing here is to make sure that you really understand the Bill of Rights. These are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that were quickly adopted in 1789 under the first Congress. They were largely written by the father of the Constitution, James Madison, and they were adopted by the states by 1791. So these are the basic freedoms of people and states that protect you, protect each person from excessive federal government. So there you have it. There's the differing ideological positions on the structure and function of the government. In our next lesson on the Constitution, we're going to talk about a few more things like the separation of powers, federalism, checks and balances, the Electoral College. So we'll dive into a few more concepts on the Constitution, and I hope you'll tune in, and I hope this was helpful for you. And if so, please like and subscribe.